Greetings. Welcome to the Animal Rights Show. That entrance sounds really good with headphones. I've never heard that before, so that's pretty good. So welcome along, everyone. We're back.
Good evening.
Hello.
Right. Okay. So we've got a packed program today, as the two runners used to say. Do you want to do a couple of intros first, Wendy, or because I want to do a couple of messages before we start as well?
Intros for people who are here, do you mean?
Yeah.
Or yes.
Yeah.
Okay, let's say a couple of hellos then. So we have got Michael in the house, as they say. Hello, vegan lovelies, Michael says. We've got someone called Roger Yates. I don't know who that is. We've got Carolyn Harris here. Hey, Carolyn, nice to see you. We've got Jeremy the Ape. Lovely to see you too, Jeremy. And Deb Thompson's here. And Spiritual Vegan. Good evening, everyone. Lovely to see you all.
Yeah, people are starting to come into the house, as we call it. So don't forget, everyone, if you're watching on YouTube, that's the best place to have an interactive chat. If you're on either of the Facebook channels, then we will be able to see your comments, but you won't be able to see if people respond back to them. And just in general terms, we don't charge anybody to put anything up on the screen, so feel free to comment away. Kimberley is keen to take questions on, law and, equity and this kind of stuff and all that kind of thing. So that's a joke, by the way, folks. So let's stick to the animal issue. Right. And so I think that's about it. So, Kimberley, do you want to introduce yourself or do you want us to do it?
I'm happy to introduce myself. I'm Kimberley Moore. I'm from the United States. I am an attorney. I officially specialize in tax, equity, and finance, but my passion is animal law. And I recently released my first book. It's The Case for the Legal Protection of Animals, Humanity's Shared Destiny with the Animal Kingdom. And in this book, I set forth the case for the more ethical treatment of animals based on our shared planetary crises like deforestation, climate change, and the like. I am a fierce animal advocate. I've been vegan for 10 years, and I love to connect with people to talk about all the great things that are happening for animals around the world.
Great, that's really good. So, okay, so you were kind enough to send us a copy of your book. So we're loaded up with questions, hopefully. The one that stuck out for me, actually, to kick us off, was that you were saying that the greatest problem for the legal status of our fellow animals is the fact that they're classified as property. So is there any movement on that? I know you talk about how the classification is changing around the world, instead of talking about things, talking about, living beings, living creatures, that kind of stuff. So is that really making a change, do you think?
It is. I mean, for thousands of years, animals have been classified as property of the states, all the way back to Macedonia, Rome, Greek, all the way up to the modern day common law. Animals are considered as chattel, like your kitchen table or chair. There is a movement. Dozens of countries have now classified animals as sentient beings, which means that they are different from property. They have the ability to feel pain, joy, pretty much most emotions that humans experience. That is not the end-all be-all. I mean, countries that have classified animals as sentient still have their own issues. And it is that classification has yet to funnel through to the day-to-day realities for animals. But it's a start. It's better than just classifying animals as property.
And this is about which species? I imagine it's not about sea animals, for example, in most cases. Is it mostly about primates, cats and dogs, the ones considered companion animals, or is it more universal, all animals?
It does vary by country, but as far as I've seen, it has tended to be universal. Now, the reality is a lot different from the law. Fish, of course, is the most different from us. They get the least protection. So countries are still allowing fishing, hunting, animal agriculture, etc. So in one sense, it has yet to make a substantial change for animals in their day-to-day lives. But from a legal perspective, it is monumental because we are talking about reversing legal systems that have been around for thousands of years. So to recognize animals as living beings, something other than chattel, is quite dramatic in the legal world.
And is it true, Kimberley, that with that regard to other animals being seen as so-called property, that a lot of the laws that are in place currently are to protect those individuals as if they are the human's property? So really they're protecting the human and the human's property as opposed to protecting the individual animal themselves. Would that be true, do you think?
That is absolutely correct. I mean, most laws that we have now in the books are in the form of anti-cruelty laws, although those laws do not protect institutionalized animals such as farmed animals or animals in research. They fail to adequately provide any protection whatsoever. But a more meaningful classification under the law would be to treat animals as legal persons. And there is precedent in the law. We've treated rivers, corporations, other sort of non-living inanimate objects as persons, legal persons under the law. So that would provide a much more meaningful classification for animals, because that means an attorney like myself, if an animal is abused, we can put the person in jail, although frankly that never happens. We can find them, but then the animal is left on his or her own. So if there are, for example, injuries to the animal from the act of cruelty, the animal currently has no right to veterinary care because the animal is just viewed as chattel. But as a legal person, I could go in the court and I could tell the judge, this animal has been victimized and it needs, $1,000 worth of veterinary care. We're asking for this on behalf of the animal. That would be a tremendous change in how laws currently view animals. But right now, it pretty much, as you say, protects people as owners of animals, as property, essentially, rather than protecting the animal itself.
There's a question from Deb there, Roger. I don't know if you can bring that up actually for Kimberley. Will it be necessary to have an amendment to the Constitution in order to have animals defined as persons in the United States?
That is actually a very insightful question. A number of countries have actually built into their constitutions the rights of animals to live freely without exploitation. The UN has recognized the rights of nature, and I think 150 countries have memorialized in their laws the right to a healthy environment, which is critical for animals and their habitats. The United States is a tough country because most of the changes for animals happen at the local or state level. At the federal level, there's very few protections. In fact, one of the main laws that does exist, the Humane Slaughter Act, fails to protect 98% of the animals that are slaughtered for food. So I think that would be a wonderful change. But currently in the United States, I like to say the U.S. Congress is where good laws go to die. I could rattle off 10 examples of laws that have been in good faith been introduced to protect animals, whether it's greyhound racing or protecting animals from research, due to cosmetics. That's something that has been, universally accepted worldwide, that we shouldn't research on animals, test on them for cosmetics. That bill is currently in the House where it is essentially flat. So, yeah, I would love to have a constitutional amendment. That would be amazing to recognize certain, I call them dignity rights of animals, the right to live free from exploitation and harm, the right to be protected under the laws and represented in courts. I think the reality, though, would be most of the changes are at the state and local level in the U.S.
Going back to the legal personhood point, in my experience, people get very confused between when you talk about legal persons and the category of people, and they kind of dismiss the former because of the latter. So is that a kind of like a language hurdle for you?
Well, Steve Weiss is an attorney that just passed away this year. He spent his life dedicating his time and skills to achieve legal personhood for animals. There's essentially two classifications under the law. One is a person and one is a property. And that is sort of the great divide that exists between animals and our court systems. I see that, Jeremy is making an excellent comment. Even if animals are treated as sentient, how, he doesn't do much to change their lives. And I mean, that is the reality of any law. Law is not the end all be all to what we need to do. I mean, once laws are enacted, there has to be enforcement. There has to be a reconciliation with how our other laws and industries treat animals. And there has to be public awareness campaigns to bring the public along. So I agree with that. It's not the end all be all. I think it's a necessary but not a sufficient requirement for animals that the laws recognize their sentience and their status as legal persons under the law.
Kimberley, just building on Jeremy's question there, because one thing that I wanted to ask you as well is one of the fundamental wrongs done to our fellow animals is that they're forced to have children. So we call that, manipulated breeding, selective breeding, and all of that. So generally, this is not spoken very much about in our movement, even because we tend to talk about our fellow animals because they're here and they deserve to have their moral rights respected and all of that stuff. But I just wonder, with that in mind, with the kind of forced selective breeding, how could the law or legal reform help to change that? Or how could animal law develop in a way that would start to deal with this issue, the fundamental wrong of actually forcing it? Because it's an obvious violation of our fellow animals' bodily autonomy, which ought to be an inalienable, and it's really hard to say that, isn't it? An inalienable right.
Yeah,
I think it's inalienable. It ought to be, but it isn't. But how could it be developed in that way?
Of course. Yeah, I mean, big picture animal law did not exist 3 decades ago. In the United States, as late as 2001, we had 9 animal law classes in our law schools. We now have over 100 at prestigious law schools such as Harvard, Yale, Michigan. And so we are only at the very, very beginning of what is going to be transformative for animals. So breeding animals, as I said, in the United States, animals tend to be protected at the local and state level. So California is one of the few states that has taken the initiative. They recently passed the Orca Protection Safety Act, which bans the breeding of whales in captivity. Now, of course, any lawyer will tell you that it's all in the detail and interpretation. So, there's a difference between forced breeding versus animals that happen to breed because they're stuck in captivity. Laws have not gone that far yet, but I believe they will. It's just a matter of time, because you're right. Forced breeding is just another form of animal cruelty and exploitation. It happens in every industry: fur farming, factory farms, sea worlds of the globe. So yes, there is room for laws to improve that. It just seems to be very incremental at the current time.
I think it's actually, if we actually did away with forcing other animals to have children, then we would do away with most of the industries of use, because you wouldn't be able to have so-called agriculture, so-called companion animals, and all the rest of the industries where they're used. That would be a massive.
That is correct, because behind every industry there are breeding facilities that prop up the industry itself. So, for example. Mm-hmm. In the United States, we have, as of 2019, about 68,000 chimps in research labs. But behind that industry are breeding facilities that house another 40,000 chimps, just sort of standing by, ready to be shipped off to research facilities. So it is sort of the ugly driver of many industries, without a doubt.
Kimberley, I was impressed by the title. It reminded me a lot of Tom Regan's title, A Case for Animal Rights. And when I read your title, I was wondering, was this done on purpose? Did you want to, to highlight the juxtaposition between ethical rights and moral rights and legal rights? Which ones do you think are more important? And was this an effort to highlight how important it is to encode moral rights and make them into the laws. What was the rationale behind that decision?
Such a great question, because it really goes to the heart of my book. Reagan made the case for the moral and ethical treatment of animals, whereas my book makes the case for the proper legal treatment of animals. But I worked on this book for 5 years, and I looked high and low for every end-all, be-all grounds for granting animals more protection under the law. And there are, in fact, many grounds. There's climate change, there's deforestation, there's violence begets more violence. There's many reasons why our laws should be improved. But ultimately, the strongest case for animal protection is the public's will. The public has come a long way in the last 2 decades. We now have social media, which shows us each and every act of cruelty, which just goes viral at this time. In the United States and in other countries, the public is demanding changes. They're demanding cruelty-free options, food options, fashion options. We see this around the globe. The public is driving the private sector, and the private sector is driving new laws. So ultimately, even though I set forth many grounds for protecting animals in my book, it really does come down to what does the public want? And what the public wants, the public should get in a democracy, right? I always think about the 2015 Gallup poll. They asked Americans, do you think that animals should be protected? And 2/3 said yes, they should receive some level of protection and rights. But 1/3 said they should have rights equal to humans. So that's the American public passionately, the American public loves animals and they're demanding changes. But at the same time, there's a disconnect with laws, because laws are basically passed for special interests in the United States. And there's a disconnect between what the public wants and our current laws. But that is changing slowly. But yes, ethics and moral, it all comes down to ethics and morals as the driver of changes for animals.
I wanted to build on that Gallup poll that you just mentioned in 2015, because in the book you were saying that 1/3 of North Americans said that our fellow animals should have the same rights, which obviously is an interesting question, because a lot of animal ethicists have gone out of their way to explain that other animals don't have the same rights, in the sense that, kind of basic rights are different from non-basic rights and this kind of stuff. And so I'm wondering was that just a sloppy question, or was that, what was going on in terms of the Gallup poll itself? Do you know?
It was a very vague question. There wasn't a lot of meat around that, probably the wrong metaphor. But essentially, animals have their own needs and rights. I mean, on the one hand, they need the same rights as humans. They need to be recognized as legal persons, because otherwise they don't have recourse in courts. On the other hand, they don't need voting rights. They don't need a lot of rights that humans, but it really comes down to those dignity rights, the right to live as their instincts and nature would require, their right not to be exploited, and most importantly, the right to bodily integrity. So I think the poll was a little vague, but I think it captured the heart when Americans say, they deserve equal rights. That tells me that they put animals on par with people. And so that's where the laws are headed eventually.
Kimberley, do you think, kind of building on that, and also a question that I think I mentioned to you the other day, and also Jeremy's brought something similar up in the chat as well. So obviously we're all kind of converging with our questions. When we ask people, and by people I'm saying humans, because I believe that our fellow animals are also people, but when we're talking about humans and what they want and how the law is going in that direction, do humans actually understand that actually, say for example, as animal rights advocates, we want an end to use. We want abolition of use. We don't just want a continuation of use where other animals have got some protection in terms of they've got a little bit of protection of their welfare, their well-being, but they're going to carry on being used. So when they give these responses saying, oh yes, I think our fellow animals should have equal rights to people, are they understanding it in that context? Are they understanding that actually, if we respected the inherent rights of our fellow animals, actually they would not be able to continue business as usual in terms of who they consume, who they wear, who is tested on, who is there for their entertainment, etc.? Or do they see it under the umbrella of a welfarist, speciesist society? And what's your perspective on that?
Yes, I definitely think that people see it both ways. I mean, for the people that are advocating for better welfare rights, so things like a fifth of the states in the U.S. have bans on battery cages for hens and those tight pens for pigs and cows. I mean, I think what they're trying to get is to prevent torture and suffering before they're slaughtered. But as you say, they're going to be slaughtered. And so the biggest concern is, are we passing laws that make people complacent? They now tell themselves, well, we've given hens more space, we've given cows more space, we need not worry about anything more. I mean, that is the risk. But I think a lot of the legal strategy behind the welfare reforms are that we will disrupt supply chains. So, for example, California's Prop 12 was one of the most progressive farm animal measures on the planet. It gave animals just a tiny bit more space. But what happened is that other states can't meet the standards. The pork suppliers, if they implement the changes, their industry is no longer profitable. So I think, it's a double-edged sword. To the extent we can disrupt supply chains, change industries, how they operate, that is a great thing. But ultimately, we should never lose the message that what animals really need is to be free from any and all exploitation, and they should have the right to live, which is a fundamental dignity right.
It worries me, to be honest, this thing about the right to welfare. In the book, you mentioned some question why rights should be afforded to our fellow animals when animal welfare laws exist. You mentioned that the same question was asked in relation to women's rights, and the suffragists you mentioned, which is quite unusual. Most people focus on suffragettes, which is thing. So is there always this danger that we're going to end up with welfare rights rather than real rights?
Well, that would be a terrible result. I think a lot of the welfare changes are indicative of legal reforms that are slow to change. Humans are a very slow species to change, and typically it requires incremental changes. Even for vegans typically go vegetarian. They give up certain animals. They go vegetarian, and then over time they get rid of dairy. But the law is even worse than that. The law is very slow to change because common law by its very nature is based on precedents and what has been done for thousands of years. So I think that, it's sort of a necessary but an evil element to improving lives for animals. I mean, it's very unlikely as a practical matter that we're going to pass a state law that says everyone has to eat plant-based proteins going forward January 1. I mean, that's just never going to happen in the US or in any country. So the reforms are to, as I say, prevent suffering and torture before an animal is killed, but it's also, more importantly, to raise awareness. So even though animals are given a tiny bit more space, the public now sees the cages. On social media, they can see what the so-called improved welfare laws are doing. And hopefully they'll say, wow, the animal's still not able to, live its life as nature intended. So that's the goal, is public awareness. Not preventing suffering and torture is always a good thing. But ultimately, the end goal has to be liberation for animals. That is the end goal with no doubt.
Then we've got to think about things like expenditure of resources in terms of effort and money and those kind of things, because there's always that kind of worry in the movement that I know of. Should we catch up with a couple of points that have been made in the chat before we continue, folks? So we've got
there's some great comments going on in there.
Yeah. So Deb, is sentience a characteristic necessary for personhood for animals? And if so, is there an accepted definition of that for all animals? I know there's been some coverage recently about this.
Yes, there is no universal definition of sentience. It's defined differently by various countries and their laws. Sentience, Peter Singer, who was the author of Animal Liberation, argued that animal suffering is sort of what should drive us to adjust our moral compass vis-a-vis animals. I mean, there's other theories and legal thoughts. Practical autonomy is something that Steve Weiss, who's the former head of the Non-Human Rights Project, thought that practical autonomy should be sort of a driver of how we look at animals. And I said to Steve passed away in February this year. He spent his life talking about how we need legal personhood for animals. And I said to Steve, and this is probably 5 years ago, but practical autonomy, that's almost impossible given limited resource. I mean, you need research, you need resources to prove this. And he said, well, that's the nature of the law. The law is very slow to evolve. We get practical autonomy recognized for animals as a condition for legal personhood, and then all bets are off. Because we know animal advocates know that all animals are equal in terms of their ability to suffer, their ability to recognize themselves vis-a-vis others. We instinctively already know this. We just need research to support that. So yes, sentience is one sort of line of thought. Practical autonomy is another one. But all roads lead to the same place: legal personhood for animals.
Do you think there's any mileage in? I don't know if you're familiar with Richard Ryder's concept of painience rather than sentience. And so he would talk about sentience, but he would also talk about painience to try and get people to, because his take on sentience was always to focus on the pain part of it, which I know a lot of people do and other people find problematic. So, are you kind of familiar with painience as an idea?
Only briefly. If you want to just introduce the audience a little bit, that would probably be helpful.
Well, it's just really the fact that I think Ryder was trying to, because he's the guy who coined the phrase speciesism. And I think Ryder was really trying to get people to focus on the important part of the sentience debate, which for him was the pain. And so, there's a famous debate from 1989 where he takes the rostrum and says, I want to talk about pain, so it was always about pain. So I think that it was almost like that phrase was to focus people's attention in the area that he thought was the most important.
Yeah, I think suffering in the animal kingdom, whether it's on factory farms, research labs, that is the driver for many legal reforms. But I think that is a good step in the right direction. But I think that we also need to recognize that animals are a lot more like us than we realize. They have the same emotions, the same desires. I guess if they're denied the ability to live their life as nature intends, that would be a form of pain. But there's physical pain, and then there's mental pain. There's torture, and there's anguish, and there's suffering on the mental level as well. I would just want to make sure that his concept of pain also captures, for example, wild animals in circuses. More than 50 nations has recognized that animals suffer mentally because they're confined 23 and a half hours a day, and they're denied anything they would prefer to be doing rather than entertaining us. So, I tend to focus more on the psychological and the mental anguish that animals endure as pain as well.
Isn't there a bit of an irony? Because we were talking about the idea of, these new kind of recognitions of the categories that are changing this property status. But in animal welfare law, it's always said things like, you're not allowed to terrorize our fellow animals, which implies that they accepted those kind of things in the first place.
Of course, absolutely. Yeah. Unfortunately, laws are not yet extending that thinking into research laboratories and factory farms. For some reason, the vast majority of animals that are tortured and who suffer, they're just left out of the conversation when it comes to pain and suffering. And we tend to focus on companion animals because they live with us, they sleep with us, they're part of our families. We can understand that. So I think part of the goal is to extend that understanding and empathy to other species in the animal kingdom, because they're really no different from our companion animals. Yeah.
Should we move to Carolyn's question? You like this one, actually, Kimberley, because you've actually got a big section in the book which covers this. If I understand correctly, legal recognition for non-human animal personhood would also lead to strong protection of the ecosystems, bracket forest, oceans, wetlands, deserts in which they live. So this is right up your street, really, in terms of your chapter or section on the rights of nature, yeah?
Absolutely. I mean, without a doubt, when we achieve legal personhood for animals, and we will in time do that, we would have to reevaluate all of our laws to see how they are impacting animals. And habitat loss is the biggest driver of species extinctions today. Climate change and pollution are also drivers, but there's probably nothing more important to animals than habitats. And we have lost so many forests. Deforestation is so big right now as an issue. It's actually uniting countries to come together to halt and reverse deforestation. We cannot live without trees. Trees and plants remove vast amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Otherwise, that carbon dioxide would sit right in our atmosphere and create a greenhouse effect. If you think of greenhouses, the big bubble and how it traps heat and gases, that's exactly what's happening to our atmosphere. And that itself is also driving loss of habitats. I mean, it's all sort of connected. When we lose biodiversity, we lose more habitats. So absolutely, legal personhood is just the first step we need to get to. And then we have to reconcile all of our laws to account for how our actions are impacting the animal kingdom.
I had a question that, do you feel that the laws that exist right now, laws that protect habitats, for example, see other animals as only as parts of a species? So they are protecting biodiversity, but they are not protecting the individual. So I have this feeling that for these laws, there is no individual, there are numbers. Like
Yes.
there are large numbers or small numbers of this or that species, and some species are endangered, all that. But it's as if the law doesn't see an individual in every fox, in every polar bear, that have the right to be protected because they are an individual and not only as part of a species.
Yes. I mean, that is true. Most of the laws today, most of the environmental and conservation laws, including many of the international frameworks for protecting biodiversity, do focus on species as a whole. That said, there are also laws that we're starting to see that protect the individual. So, for example, in Italy, it is illegal to keep a lobster on ice while it is being served in a restaurant. So this is one of the welfare laws. I mean, the law is meant to prevent suffering and torture before the animal is ultimately killed. Ultimately, we don't want the lobster to be killed. That's our end goal. But I think laws like that do help us focus on individual animals, because ultimately legal personhood does not apply to women as a class, as to minorities as a class, as to different communities as a class. It focuses on the rights of the individual. And so that's why it's so important that we get legal personhood for animals everywhere.
Do you think, Kimberley, with that legal personhood, because I know Steve Wise was working very much on that especially for certain primates, cetaceans, and it was very much focused on certain individuals or species of individuals. Do you feel that if one precedent was set, like we achieved legal personhood for one elephant, for example, that would then affect all other species? Or would there be a thing like it was very much the iconic species that people really relate to and think of as more important, like elephants, like whales, for example, or dolphins, or would that trickle through to other species who people don't relate to as much, like reptiles, for example? Is there a potential that we might get restricted with that?
Steve Weiss's research his legal analysis was based on research in the areas of animal cognition and intelligence. And so he necessarily focused on honeybees and chimpanzees. He even focused on his 4-year-old son and his dog, all because there was enough research in the areas of animal cognition and intelligence to support the legal theory that he was moving towards. So I think that even having a law recognize an elephant as a legal person would be so earth-shattering from a legal perspective. It would be, the first time in thousands of years, or certainly since the dawn of the legal age for common law. It would be so groundbreaking that it would, I believe, shatter a lot of barriers, and there would probably, I would predict, tons more research on other species, because his argument was based on the practical autonomy of animals. Do they have self-awareness? Are they aware that they're a separate individual vis-a-vis someone else? Do they have desires and drives? Do they understand, their role in the world? And I think, if we had that groundbreaking recognition of elephants, I think there would be tremendous research for other species, and I think it would come very quickly.
It seems like we're all it seems like we're always basing our criteria on very human-centric values and things that we feel are important, instead of, I think sometimes the way we look at the world is kind of reinforcing the problems that created where we're at in the first place. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's so difficult to break down that human supremacy. Even with the work that we do within the movement, we're still we have those filters that everything is so anthropocentric and so based on our own judgment and value system. Like, oh, other animals need to be like us in this way, otherwise they're not important enough. Do you know what I mean? It seems very
and not surprising, when we test animal intelligence, universally we test animals vis-a-vis human abilities. But we are it's amazing when we start looking at the powers and the abilities of animals in the animal kingdom. They have talents far beyond anything that humans could do. But we always base our research, can Coco the gorilla, can Coco be taught sign language? Well, yes, she learned over 200 words. But how many of us could speak the language of chimpanzees? I mean, 0 to date. There's absolutely a bias in research. Absolutely a bias. We always test animal intelligence vis-a-vis humans. Yep.
And there's also an ableist kind of sort of thread there as well, isn't there? If we start to base the value of an individual on abilities and intelligence and skills or whatever, there is definitely an ableist slant for that.
Yeah, and I could envision a world where animals are granted rights and protections that differ among species. So the rights of dolphins, of course, would differ from the rights of land animals. Dolphins would surely appreciate no plastic in their habitats. I mean, when we look at what we're doing to the oceans, it's unconscionable. Dolphins have incredible sonar rights. Whales communicate in ways we are just beginning to understand. And what do? We have long fishing lines that just drag the bottom of oceans and pick up any and everything. The bycatch percentage is 10 to 40% bycatch animals that are caught that were not intended to be part of the fishing expedition. And if all that's not enough, the U.S. drops 40-pound bombs on the Atlantic Ocean. They did one in 2021 as a part of military testing, and it caused a 3.9 magnitude earthquake. So, yeah, I mean, we need to just stop tormenting and abusing animals and their habitats as just step one. I mean, and we're not even near to the level where we're thinking about different species and what different species need, species appropriate protections. We're not even there yet.
What percentage of the population do you think that we must reach, a population that has an anti-speciesist mindset in order for people to demand change and demand legal personhood for other animals?
Oh, the so-called tipping point. I have read 3 to 5%. You look at like how the explosion of vegan food options and fashion options. If vegans are 1 to 2% of the population, depending on the country, and they are driving billion-dollar industries and new food products and fashion products, I don't think it takes very much, because that 1 and 2% are going to bring along everyone else, right? I mean, any population, psychologists would say there's leaders in every country and society, and then they drive the changes and everybody else will follow. So I don't think there needs to be many people. I mean, it just needs to take, the research in food production is so amazing now when we start thinking about cellular technology and growing animal meat without, the sentience, without animals, suffering. So, the promise is to take one cell from a turkey and to turn it into 20 million turkey nuggets. I mean, that it doesn't take the whole population to support that. It just takes a few really good entrepreneurs and a growing movement of people who want to eat cruelty-free. And all of a sudden, you have a product that's available for the entire market. So I think the good news is the tipping point does not have to be high as we think it needs to be.
And yet, I'm thinking about women's rights, for example, or LGBTQ rights. We have much larger percentage of the populations being pro these rights, and yet there is a great difficulty in some countries to recognize femicide, for example. Although a large number of the public demands that. So maybe, why do you think this happens? Because it seems that even in the so-called democracies, people do not have their say in things.
Yeah,
there is this illusion of democracy.
Yes, I mean, I think that given you can have even the best laws on the books, but that's not going to get rid of bigotry and violence and discrimination. There's always going to be that element of the population that has not yet been taught, which is why humane education is so important, because time and time again, when people are showed the realities of cruelty that animals face, they want no part of it. But there's always going to be that. That's why laws are also important, because that portion of the population that perpetuates violence and discrimination and bigotry. I mean, there's laws, that could protect victims from that. But honestly, the public also. I mean, if someone commit an act of cruelty against an animal or says something big, a bigotry, there is fierce public backlash. The public steps in when laws are not there to protect people and animals. And we see that time and time again. That's why I love social media. It's a double-edged sword. But, when things like that happen, people lose jobs, they lose their influence, they lose money. I mean, think about the dentist who killed the lion. His business was nearly shut down. So, yeah, I mean, I wish there were laws to prevent that cruelty and bigotry, but, in the best of countries, there's probably always going to be that.
Something happened just here in the UK just today, actually, with that in mind, that a calf had escaped. I think quite a big calf, not a tiny calf, but they classified this particular cow as a calf, had escaped from a farm and was, I think, running close to one of the motorways. I've not actually read the thing in great detail, but I've caught up a little bit on it, and they were running by the side of a motorway, and so the police, in order to stop some kind of mayhem or danger to the human public or whatever, they've actually rammed their car into the calf to try to stop her or him, and then they buckled, got up, and then they did it again. I think they rammed the poor calf about 5 times. Good and bad news is, one, the good news is the calf is well, or believe well, but the calf has been returned to the farm where they escaped from. But there's a massive backlash against the police who did this. There's a massive backlash from people in the animal movement trying to get the calf to a sanctuary because they, had the wherewithal to liberate themselves for a moment. And then there's the backlash from non-vegan public who are saying that this shouldn't happen, the police shouldn't have done this, and all this kind of stuff. So there is a massive backlash. So and I know you talk in the book about the role of the media in driving change, and I just wonder, in that situation, how could legal reforms or additional laws come in to change, to make that situation better in some way? Because of course at the moment that calf is considered property of the farmer, so the farmer has the calf back and is saying, oh, the calf's fine now, they're back and eating and drinking, but of course the calf is still property and still being used for human gain. But now there's this backlash against the police, blah blah blah. But how could, in a short term, could this be made a better situation with legal reform? What could be added into that situation to help that cow?
Legally, we could absolutely extend anti-cruelty laws to protect animals on factory farms and in research labs and in any other setting where they are exploited. But this is a story that's told time and time again. I mean, we have a 13-year-old Shih Tzu who's blind and deaf and was shot by cops in the United States. Mm-hmm. Again, massive outrage. I mean, I almost think about these animals. These stories just continue to crop up, and the abuses by people in positions of authority, which is even more shocking and distressing. But I think of these animals as sort of the mortars of our social rights movement for animals. I mean, we as animal advocates, we want every single animal to be protected. And when they are harmed, we see this massive backlash. And I just saw a comment from, is it Carolyn? She said the production of this new meat still involves animal exploitation. And that was probably my comment about the one single turkey cell and generating so many turkey nuggets. And that is absolutely true. I mean, if we could absolutely not use animals whatsoever, best case scenario.
Yeah, but I said when we met first, I'll volunteer the cells myself.
I can attest to that. The doc has volunteered to cells.
Yeah, I mean, that's the unfortunate part of what is really a magnificent movement, is that the changes are slow and incremental, at least on the law side. And the changes are just so, and even on the the private sector generating new meats and protein options, the changes are really slow. So yes, I would absolutely not want a single turkey involved in production of that. And I think that we're going to get there. I mean, I think in 20 years from now, our conversation is going to be very, very different, because the reality is our planet simply can no longer sustain an animal-based diet, period. There's no way. Climate change, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, and species extinctions are all leading to plant alternative proteins. There is no escaping that. Even if the entire planet went on a animal-free diet, we would still have emergency climate change crises to deal with. And with that, all of the destructive weather events. We've sort of backed ourselves into a corner. There's no road out except through those new technologies that promise, to feed meat to people who choose not to give up meat, to offer that without animal suffering. I mean, that is the road we're on.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion so far, and there's still about three major things that I want to bring up. First of all, I suppose Jeremy kind of pushed back a little bit here, because saying about the welfare getting in the way of rights, we kind of touched on that in a way, and we've got a big focus on the Animal Rights Show about language, and is one of the things that is too slow or not good enough or something like that, the language. I do notice that in the book, cruelty language is used a lot, and in terms of how you present your position, we talk about animal cruelty quite a lot. Do you think there's anything to gain to move away from that welfare language and talk about rights and rights violations instead?
I think that the incremental welfare reforms that have happened in the last 2 decades they served the purpose to get animals into the national conversation. But I do think it's time we start moving away from just increasing the sizes of cages for animals. I think that, those reforms can go a long way if we show people, oh, look, we've done this for animals, but still look at what we've achieved for the animal at three additional inches. I think that if we show exactly, it gets people talking, it gets the discussion going. But, like he said, he was vegetarian for years because industries have billions of dollars to market their products as cruelty-free, and government agencies have given them free rein to make all sorts of outrageous claims. Less so in the EU. I know they've come down on, I think, milk in the UK. Some company claimed it was humane, and they were forced to retract that. In the United States, they make every single claim under the sun. Every variation of, we have, happy animals, and they're fulfilling every natural desire, and these are the happiest animals on the planet. That's the marketing challenge that we have to face, is that it basically deceives the public. The public cares deeply about animals, and they're being deceived. And our own Federal Trade Commission allows that to happen, even though I have filed endless complaints with companies who put this marketing out. It's impossible to go down a grocery store aisle without seeing these claims. Everyone's using it. Everyone's doing it. And the public is, the public's wising up. They're starting to understand that this is humane washing. This is not true. But I think that, yes, the welfare reforms serve the purpose, but I think they need to start to go in a new direction.
And what about the language point?
For marketing and advertising?
No, in terms of the language of the movement, I would urge, for example, I'm a big fan of Tom Reagan. I'd like to go back to his language about rights violations and move away from the welfare-based cruelty language that is dominant in the movement.
Yes. And I think the laws are heading that way, because some of the laws that are being enacted are recognizing the rights of, if not just a single individual, a smaller group of rights of animals. I think of beavers have received rights to build their dams, even though humans, don't want them to do that. But yes, language is very, very important. In my book, I use the term companion animals. I don't use the term pet anymore, because that just smacks of property, something that you would own. My companions are members of my family with as many rights and desires they get fulfilled as my own. And even our wildlife. I consider animals that come onto my property as individuals. We now have 2 ducks that's taken over our swimming pool. So we no longer use that as a swimming pool. We use that as the ducks' place they can come for a safe place and quiet and peaceful swim if they want. So yes, I think language is incredibly important, and it needs to be backed up with our actions.
Going on that point about, oh, sorry, did you want to follow up on that?
No. I've got a separate matter, so go ahead and I'll raise that too.
A separate matter to be raised.
A separate matter, my lord.
Separate matter. Just going to that point of, I tend to say animal companions now. I think I used to say companion animals, because the more I've kind of looked into language, and I'm totally, we talk about language a lot on this show, and we try to assess it and evolve all the time. So it's never like, oh, this is the right thing forever. It's like, is this the right thing? Are we saying this? Can we get better on this? And so I used to say companion animal. Now I feel that companion animal is giving the other animal a role, like dairy cow or lab rat or racehorse. And so I feel like I now say animal companion, or my cat family member or something like that. So I don't give the individual a role that they're my companion. That's their role.
Don't you say fur baby, don't you, Wendy?
Fur baby. My fur babies. Oh my god. No. But to be fair, in the past I would have said that like years and years and years ago, but definitely not now. Yeah, I hear a lot of people say that, and it's definitely yeah, I don't like that anymore. But just going back to animal companions, I just wondered what your perspective on that is, Kimberley, in terms of one of your sections in the book talks about our deep connection with our fellow animals, and you mention like animal companions and how people are very much have these amazing relationships with the other animals that live with us in our homes, but also they may be used as like therapy animals in hospitals or, you know, different places like this. And there's a real benefit to humans from having this connection or this closeness, these relationships with our fellow animals. And I guess, I suppose, from an animal rights perspective, if we are to do away with the forced, manipulated, selective breeding of our fellow animals, and we no longer encourage that category of other animals as animal companions because that's for our gain, what would you feel about that? Because I guess that one of your points is it's a huge benefit that we protect our fellow animals because of these relationships we have. But I just wonder what your perspective is. Are those relationships ethical? If we were to look forward to a vegan world, would you still advocate for those relationships, or would you advocate against those relationships, generally speaking?
Those are great thoughts. I mean, your point on animal language, I mean, I think it's so important that when we describe animals, we make it clear that they're victims. So factory farmed victims, animals in research victims. I think, you know, the fact that they are being tortured and they suffer so much needs to be highlighted in how we talk about them. Companion animals are so important in the United States and elsewhere. People will literally risk their lives for their animals. Hurricane Katrina and other major hurricanes have come about. We have discovered that people will not leave their homes on the coast because their animals are not welcomed in shelters. They had to quickly pass laws that require shelters to accept companion animals. Otherwise, people would stay behind with their animals, which is something that we did when a hurricane hit a few years ago. So, I mean, I definitely, we think of companion animals as being sort of the blessed under the laws, but they are also very much at the mercy of human cruelty. There's homeless cats and dogs in numbers that there should not be. They're still in research labs around the world. They're still farmed for their meat in some countries, although Taiwan changed that. But I think our deep connection with animals can be honored and respected by more meaningful laws. So we should always require owners to provide veterinary care, adequate food and water, get rid of this stuff that we see on social media every week with dogs chained in the heat outside. I mean, companion animals, as blessed as they are still not protected adequately under the law. I mean, I think there's so much more we can do. And there's the perception that, okay, we've done fine with the companion animals, but we have not. We absolutely have not. There's a long way to go. And there should be safeguards in place, very much like we have social services for humans. There should be services in place. I mean, we're talking about animals people would risk their lives for. Why would we not provide emergency veterinary care, food, water, help for people to take proper care of their animals? Yes, I think we have a long way to go for companion animals, no doubt.
But going forward, do you think it's ethical for us to have animal companions, to so-called breed them, to have them as our companions? Or going forward, would you say, no, that shouldn't be the case? We shouldn't have them. We shouldn't be breeding them in order to live with us and have these relationships in the first place, because we're violating their bodily autonomy by forcing them to breed, and it's for our gain because we want the companions, we want the relationships. It's not their choice. They're not consenting. We don't know they're consenting. We don't know the cats that live with me and the dog that lives with me. They're here because they've kind of been forced into it. Like, it wasn't their choice, I guess. Yeah. And they might choose otherwise. They might look at me as some kind of kidnapper who's kind to them. Do you know what I mean? I don't know what they think of me. I have to assume that they're kind of all right, but I don't know.
I've got an idea.
I mean, without a doubt, hands down, no questions, we should not be breeding animals. We are still putting down millions of animals every year because there's no place to house them and for them to be cared for. I think in the immediate future, I mean, there's so many animals in shelters and at rescues. I think it is ethical to bring an animal into your home and to provide proper care for it, but only if you can provide proper care. I mean, we've seen cases, people bringing in, dozens of animals. They start out with good intentions, but it ends up being a breeding situation with lots of trauma for animals. So I think, for me, ethically, I would still adopt a dog or a cat who needs a home. Definitely, breeders need to go, and we have laws that are slowly getting us there. But I think that, if I can provide a home to an animal from a shelter, I would be comfortable with that.
I think what Elliot is getting at with this comment is a bit of a pushback. Maybe it's just that, as Jeremy the Yates was saying, it's a tricky situation because even with animal companions, there's still power relations and there's still a hierarchy, isn't there?
There absolutely is. And we're still using animal companions for things like rescue. And I hate to see those canine videos where officers are putting animals in harm's way. Yeah, I mean, when you talk about, what can we do, absolutely, protecting companions means you don't put them in harm's way. You don't breed them. You don't exploit them. But I understand. I mean, I think, if an animal could talk, it probably would not want to be in a cage at a shelter. So I could probably, justify that for myself, at least until we no longer have the overpopulation of pets. I mean, right now they desperately need homes and need to get out of shelters or they will be put down. But yeah, should we be using them, abusing them, exploiting them? Absolutely not.
Well, we're over our hour, but am I allowed to raise my other issue, Wendy? And
your separate matter. Your separate matter. I say
yes. My other matter, my lord.
Other matter. Raise a head, dog. Raise a head.
Yes, I was. I really loved chapter 4 of the book, Kimberley. Really loved it, and it's interesting. The chapter is called "The Link Between Human Rights and Animal Rights," and obviously we've got Reagan's quote from '83. The animal rights movement is a part of and not opposed to the human rights movement. And the first line you say in that chapter is "It's all connected." Now, I don't know whether you know, but there is a small but fairly vocal group of people who want separation of issues and not a connection. Whereas, you're saying, and we in the Animal Rights Show would say, that it's all entangled, it's all connected. So do you want to say something about that first, and then I've got a follow-up?
It is all connected. I mean, if we could separate those out, we would have a much better opportunity to address major climatary issues. But the reality is deforestation fuels species extinction. Deforestation fuels climate change. Climate change is destructive to human societies in terms of available food and water. It's all connected. There's no way to separate out one. Now, there are organizations that do focus on specific issues, and that's great because we need as many as we can get. But the connection is irrefutable. There's no denying that our actions in one area, whether it's the climate or our destruction of wildlife, it all has consequences across the board.
Okay, where's that from? Anybody get?
that was my ring doorbell thing.
Right. I thought the fire alarm had gone off or something.
It's tragic because something as simple as water. We have a planetary crisis that impacts billions of people. Talking about women's rights, far too many women are having to walk miles every day to get water from wells because the wells are drying up due to climate change. I mean, it's catastrophic. It's catastrophic for the poor, and our own actions individually, whether it's having a hamburger or importing wildlife, it is all connected and it has consequences.
Yes, indeed. You go on to say, well, you talk about war crimes at one point, and I was wondering about whether, in terms of, say, it looks like when the Gaza situation is resolved, if ever, there will be some kind of war tribunal. Have you ever known the plight of other animals to be part of those types of inquiries?
No, I mean, animals suffer tremendously, even in the best of conditions. But right now, 2 billion on the planet are living in conflict zones, wars and conflicts. And whether it's animals in zoos being abandoned or bombs being dropped in Ukraine. Ukraine was, 35% of the biodiversity in Europe was in Ukraine, and it's being systematically destroyed. No, animals are never taken into account because countries prioritize national security as the top issue, and we're systematically destroying vital ecosystems around the planet, vital oceans, marine ways, habitats, all being destroyed because humans cannot get along, and animals are always at the mercy. All the way back to I was reading World War II, right before Britain joined the war. There was a campaign to put companion animals down because it was deemed to be the kind act to prevent suffering. And that just flows through every single country on earth. And even the best of countries, animals suffer, even in times of peace.
I think the dark side of that British thing was that I think they were talking about maybe freezing them to use as flesh if necessary, is one thing. But do you think, going back to your social media point, do you think that because this genocide has been streamed live, as it were, that the other animals have got a chance of being part of that on this occasion?
There is a growing movement for ecocide, which is the deliberate and systematic destruction of habitats in the planet. Animals would be a part of that as a beneficiary, but not as a direct benefactor of those laws. But there is a growing movement where we are viewing the destruction of the natural world as something that is so serious it's alongside genocide and other major war crimes. And even Vietnam till this day still suffers from the effects of Agent Orange and herbicides, which were dropped to sort of drive people out who are hiding in bushes. It's unconscionable that today, 2024, Vietnam is still suffering ecological destruction from a war that happened 50 years ago. So yes, they need to be a part of the conversation. They need to be a part of making things right. I mean, I think about all the animals in the Ukraine. I see dogs running. The shelters have long been abandoned. The zoos have been abandoned. The animals that were left were eaten because people were running out of food. I mean, that's a story that is told time and time again with every single conflict. But to date, no, animals have not been properly taken into account as victims of conflicts, but they should.
Yeah, they should indeed. Jeremy
says,
conflicts. Yeah.
So much for ending on a high note.
On a high note.
Kimberley,
there is
this more, Jeremy.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to ask Kimberley. Where can people look to get your book, please?
And can we see that lovely book again?
The cover.
If you can stomach the price, and I apologize, it's academic priced because I wanted it to be in universities and law schools. That was a decision I made, for better or worse. But if you go online and Google the name, the case for the legal protection of animals, humanity's shared destiny of the animal kingdom, you will find it everywhere. It's at Barnes and Noble. It's on Amazon. I saw it at Walmart the other day. So it's everywhere. You can find it.
It must be a discount in Walmart, yeah.
You would think. I saw a price of $135 at Walmart, and I was just horrified.
Is that $135?
US dollars, yes. It's
$35.
It's priced as an academic textbook. I decided to go with the best academic publisher on the planet, which is Palgrave Macmillan, and they have done a phenomenal job marketing it, and it is being taught in universities and law schools, which is where I thought it would be good to have a first book in those settings.
Is there a way people
135 though, is that per chapter or is that the full book? 135.
Fortunately, it's the full book.
Okay.
Is there a way people who don't have lots and lots of money might be able to read some or part of your book at all, Kimberley? Or is that a possibility? Because it's so good. There's some bits, especially like Andy was just saying as well, that chapter 4 that Roger was speaking, he's recommending that as well.
I do want post sections of the book on Facebook. I'll do a section from the book if it ties to a topic of the day. But I'm really trying hard to get the price down because it really does need to reach more hands. And venues like this is phenomenal because it helps me summarize major issues, and I can put that information rather than, there's 2,000 footnotes in here, and it's heavily researched, and it very few people have made it from start to finish, if I can say that, because it's just so heavy, such a heavy read. But I try to summarize the main issues and put those on Facebook, social media, so that we can focus in on the big main points, which I think is helpful.
I started at the back, so I've done it. So,
Roger, Andy has a question for
yes.
Kimberley.
Now, Andy is a vegan filmmaker, Andy Atkinson, and on his YouTube channel, which is the same as the title there, he often narrates parts of books. And for example, the entire essays, the philosophical essays of Leslie Cross are on there. So he's asking would you mind if he narrated some of your chapter 4?
I would not mind at all. Why don't you send them my contact information if you can, and I'll just make sure that my publisher is happy with everything. But absolutely, to the extent we can, bring this to a larger audience, I am 100% supportive of that. And just to say, I am not receiving 1 penny from this book. All proceeds are being donated to the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics in the UK. I can't take 1 single penny off of animals have been exploited far enough, right? So I'm getting no profits from this. So even though it's priced high, it's not going to me.
Is that true? You told us you were going to buy a fur coat with it.
Oh, no.
Blasphemy.
I know. Are we allowed to say that on this show?
I know. Yeah.
You
I might shrivel up.
No, I could not. This was an act of love, and this was written for the animal kingdom. And I could not take a single penny off of this, morally, ethically, absolutely not. I love the Center for Animal Ethics. And Andrew Lindsay and his daughter Clara Lindsay have an amazing organization that is doing lots of wonderful projects based in research to bring about better laws and better policies for animals. So kudos to them.
Excellent.
Let's hope that your book is going to be soon in every legal library in the world. And
I would love for that. I'm actually sending it out to various people. Believe it or not, in the United States, I just sent it a copy. There's a terrible law right now called the Yates Act. If you think about all the wonderful reforms we've done for animals, the California Prop 12, the Massachusetts Question 3, all those are at risk now because a congressperson added a provision in the current farm bill that would basically undo all of the progressive measures that have been passed. So I am actually sending a copy of my book. It's going out today to this congressperson. I've left a special message in it for him, hoping this will help. I bookmarked the farm animals right in the book so he'll know where to go. But I'm sending it directly to the person that has introduced that act, because I do ultimately believe that no one is beyond redemption when it comes to animals. Many of us came to protect animals later in life. I've been a vegan for 10 years, but the first 35 years I was not a vegan. So there's always room to improve your life vis-a-vis animals and to make more ethical choices. So I hope everyone takes that message to heart.
Deborah saying, "Go get him, Kimberley."
Oh yeah, go. So
go.
I suppose we ought to wrap up. Well, I want to thank our guest panelist Kimberley Moore very much. It's been a really interesting program or show or whatever you want to call this session. Is there any final words from anyone?
Only to say thank you as well. And I second what you just said, Duck, as well. It's been really interesting and some great comments coming up as well. So it's really provoked a lot of comments, a lot of questions, a lot of thoughts. So well done, Kimberley. And thank you.
My pleasure.
And what you might get is that because a lot of people watch the recording, you might get comments. So if there's relevant those, I'll alert you to them if you give you an opportunity to respond to those as well. So, people, thank you so much for sticking with us. We shall be back. We can't say when, but we shall be back.
Hopefully
but,
2 weeks. Hopefully.
Oh, 2 weeks. Right. Okay.
2 weeks.
Well, that's pretty good for us at the moment. So, people, thanks very much for tuning in to the Animal Rights Show.